Welcome, everybody. It is episode 6 of the RSP RSP Fantasy Film and Data. And I'm joined as usual by Jay Moyer. Jay, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dwain. Really excited to get back on here and talk. Every couple weeks, it's hard not to talk to you for that long. So, really excited to see what we can discover today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump into it. We're going to talk about a couple of offenses here to start us off with the Seahawks and Lions that are just, Jay, these two offenses are really outperforming what any of us thought they would do from a fantasy perspective, or just, from, hey, just talking football perspective. But if you look at Russell Wilson, his career high in passing yards, 4,219, which was in 2016. Right now, he's already sitting at 2,500 passing yards. So I mean, this is a guy that's on pace to, break, his own record. And he's a guy that really, in most fantasy circles, you could have gotten Russell Wilson pretty late this year. Typically, in the years before, Russell Wilson was one of the top 3-4 quarterbacks taken off the board. In most drafts this year, that wasn't the case. He was a guy that you could have just, waited on and probably got, in the 9th or 10th round in most formats, as, 8th, 9th, 10th. Heck, I know that I got him a couple of times after the, past the 12th quarterback taken off the board. And I'm happy about where I own him. If you look at where he's at, he's already got 22 touchdown passes. He's only got 1 interception. And if you look at, the way that the Seahawks are doing, and if you look at his yards per attempt, Jay, it's based on these explosive plays, 8.55 yards per attempt. If you look at what he's done, under pressure, he's the number 1 rated quarterback in the league, Jay, against pressure this season as far as NFL quarterback rating goes. According to Pro Football Focus, he has a rating of 112. And, he's a guy that is actually, he's pressured pretty often, so 41% of the time he's actually under pressure whenever he drops back, which is the 3rd most. Yet he is the top rated quarterback against pressure. He's got 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 964 of his yards have actually come against pressure. So that's pretty heady stuff, that Wilson's doing, or the numbers that he's putting up. So we'll talk about the receivers here in a minute, but I just want to get your thoughts more on what you're seeing from Russell Wilson, this year. Is there anything different? Are you seeing anything different, with this offense in particular?
Well, I think a lot of people, first of all, were scared off by last season's tendency to run the ball much more. The Seahawks were probably the most run-heavy team in any game script situation you can talk about last year in 2018. And, they still put quite a bit of effort into developing their running game this year and still, try to establish the run and get that part of their offense going. But, they tend to open it up more. And Russell Wilson, there's no new development that he is an elite quarterback. Interestingly, there was a debate this offseason about whether Russell Wilson truly is elite, which was just somewhat silliness. And, there were also narratives out there that he needed a run-heavy offense to be effective because if you were to put the offense on his shoulders, he may falter. But really, when we talk about Russell Wilson, a couple things stand out to me. One is just his control over any type of situation. You can call it poise or whatever. But when he's pressured, the guy never gets flustered. He's obviously a great athlete, so he has the athleticism to evade tacklers. He has great pocket awareness, and he just never panics. There are guys in his face, and he's still calmly surveying downfield. And then you add on top of that the ability to throw accurate passes to any location really in the field from a variety of arm angles. And, those two things, the poise and then the arm talent, really add up to the explanation for why he's so elite under pressure. You saw him last week against Tampa Bay, where he's leading multiple game-tying, game-winning drives. And really, it's you really got to take time to enjoy these types of performances when elite athletes are put in those situations to really just show off their talents. You compare him to what we saw last night with Phillip Rivers, who, don't get me wrong, he's been a great quarterback through his career, but he's coming to the tail end of his career and doesn't have that ability to deal with pressure like Russell Wilson does. And they get to the 2-minute drill against the Raiders, and Phillip Rivers is over 8 on his attempts, throws an interception to end the game, really just tossing the ball up because of perceived pressure. So it's really, really fun to watch Russell Wilson execute in those situations because honestly, there's not much you can do. And so, it's fun to see that Seattle's really opened up the offense a bit more from what they did last year. And unsurprisingly, he's been able to capitalize.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that folks were looking at, and you're definitely right about the tendencies of the Seahawks, right, and Schottenheimer, along with Pete Carroll and what we've seen historically, and they're still passing the ball 54% of the time, running the ball 46% of the time. If you go by dropbacks, which will include your sacks and then your scrambles, 58% of the time, they're actually attempting to pass the ball, which is, still one of the lower in the league. It's not down with San Francisco, which, is at 45%, because they run the ball, literally almost all of the time. But I think the other thing that folks might have been a little bit worried about is, okay, so Doug Baldwin is gone. He retired. You got a young guy coming in DK Metcalf. He's just a rookie. Tyler Lockett, while he had performed well, in a role where he didn't have to necessarily always be the centerpiece of the offense, I think there were some concerns also about, just how well could Tyler Lockett perform whenever defenses were really more focused on him and trying to take him away. So when you look at, those receivers and you look at what Russell Wilson has done, really well, I mean, Wilson this season, Jay, he's got 49 attempts of 20 yards or longer, which is the third most in the league, and that's 49 attempts on 200 out of 293. So when you actually bring it, to a percentage, he actually has more deep attempts than any other. From a percentage standpoint, he is the quarterback that attempts the most deep passes, in the league. And he's always been really good at that. But I feel like a big component of that really, comes down to, what we're seeing with Tyler Lockett stepping up, and answering, the call as far as, being able to take on more. If you look at Tyler Lockett from a standpoint, of his deep passing targets, he's got 16 on the year, and it's crazy when you look at Wilson and his receivers and their conversion rates on these, because he's got 16 targets and he's got 10 receptions. He's got 1 drop, but he's got 3 on these passes over 20 yards. He's got 283 yards, and then he's got 3 touchdowns. And then DK Metcalf is, fourth, on the list for target, catch rate on these deep passing balls. Lockett's number 2 in the NFL. DK Metcalf's number 4. And again, this goes back to Wilson. But these guys are performing well. Metcalf's got 308 yards, and he's got 3 touchdowns on plays of over 20 yards. So these two guys, seem to be a perfect match for what Russell Wilson does really well. A guy that can sit back there and, like you talked about, he can elude the pass rush. He can buy time. There's a lot of things that he does well whenever it comes to being under pressure. And then by buying that little bit of extra time, he's also able to deliver. He's a very accurate deep passer. And then he's got these weapons now that are just, it just seems like a perfect match, really, from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing with the construction of their offense, the talent that's around Wilson's talent in and of itself, is all right on track, and really is reflective of smart coaching. Nobody wants to give Pete Carroll and the Seahawks credit, but they've been a successful organization, for the past decade or so. They've won a Super Bowl, and it's smart football. Russell Wilson is elite in many categories, but probably the thing that he does better than anybody else in football from the quarterback position is throw the deep ball. It's really uncanny in terms of his accuracy, and for that reason he throws deep more than other people, more than almost any other quarterback, or I guess every other quarterback this year, and also completes a much higher percentage of those passes than you would expect. And when you talk about Tyler Lockett, he's a smaller receiver, is fast, but you don't necessarily think of those guys as being great. Those small receivers being great contested, deep downfield players. Lockett is excellent at tracking the ball. Physical coverage doesn't really affect him, especially on the deep passes. You've seen many plays where he's catching the balls, at sort of awkward angles, physical contact at the last second, making the ball adjustment, really, selling out, not worrying about how he's going to land, etc., and making the play. So that Lockett is obviously a great fit, and his chemistry with Wilson has been well documented, in the media, but then also just as you look at the efficiency of targets that Tyler Lockett has received over the past couple years. And then when you talk about DK Metcalf, he's a guy that the NFL was lower on than most of the draft media. A football player that you design an NFL blitz, essentially, embodies explosiveness. He's huge, running a 4.3 40. And in college, when you look at his success, it was on these deep passes where he's able to use his size to separate at the line and then accelerate, stack the corner, get a pass over the top. He's good at tracking the ball, good hands, catching it over the shoulder. And really, it's, again, the perfect fit with Russell Wilson. There are a lot of quarterbacks where if you plug DK Metcalf into the lineup and, had him running routes for those quarterbacks, they wouldn't really be able to target him effectively. But it's just the perfect weapon for Russell Wilson to have because he can lay that in over the top very accurately. Metcalf is going to be able to get some separation down the field. So if it's an accurate pass, it's a long touchdown. And, that's been reflected in those numbers that you just mentioned. And so when you already have those two guys, it's just smart design of your offensive personnel, and it's going to lend itself to effective passing downfield. And now one thing that, we haven't really thought about or even talked about is adding in another receiver who's really, excellent in terms of running those intermediate and downfield routes, and that's Josh Gordon. And you and I have both professed our admiration for Gordon on this podcast and elsewhere. In watching him with the Patriots, he's probably not quite as explosive as he has been in years past, especially, that all-pro season in 2013. But he still is an excellent route runner, really plays the receiver position with refinement, runs good downfield intermediate routes, is excellent at working leverage against corners. He really has made some spectacular plays this year that gets somewhat overlooked because the volume hasn't been there in the Patriots offense. But definitely still is showing flashes of being a really excellent playmaker down the field. In the Patriots offense, Brady's often looking to work defenses underneath at this stage in his career. So it wasn't necessarily a great fit where he's going to force targets in there to Gordon. But now when you have Gordon, Metcalf, and Lockett, three guys whose strengths really align well with what Russell Wilson does well, I don't really see how many teams are going to be stopping this offense. And in terms of talking about Russell Wilson's fantasy potential, very good chance that he's the number one quarterback when we look back at the end of the season.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't see really, a scenario where he finishes outside of the top 3 or 4 for sure. And I'm with you. I think at this point, it's safe to say that he could easily finish as the number one. You'd like to see a little bit more volume in passing, but this is nothing new, like you said, for Russell Wilson. He's always been more about being efficient versus volume. So it isn't something where a lot of times whenever you have situations like this, there is the whole argument of the regression to the mean, but it's like the regression to what mean? Like Russell Wilson has proven through his career where his mean is, and so for him, whenever he's got these types of weapons, which these might be the best 2 weapons that he's had as far as having 2 guys that can consistently stretch the field, and play to his strengths. This might be the best scenario that he's been in. So I'm with you. I mean, we're 9 games in. Obviously, we've got more to play. You've got Deshaun Watson, Lamar Jackson. Those guys are all sitting right there pretty close. But before we move off of the Seahawks, just how valuable do you see Josh Gordon being? Because, I mean, while Russell Wilson, can play through, these things through efficiency, and his receivers, they certainly have their big weeks. But if you add another mouth to feed, and now all of a sudden, you're only dropping back to pass on 58% of your plays, which is one of the lower in the league, but now you're splitting that 3 ways. Do you see this being a scenario where, Josh Gordon potentially eats into what the other 2 guys are doing? Or do you just see it as being, Gordon will probably, have a role where he's getting a little bit, less. Maybe he's just really taking on more of what we've seen, over the past, several weeks from, David Moore. And then you also have, Jerron Brown, who's worked in, those two guys, Jay, they're typically out there, between the two of them, they're typically out there for like 70% to 80%, of the snaps. And between the two of them, they're usually running about the same, rate of dropbacks routes per dropback for Russell Wilson. And those are, Jerron Brown's definitely more of an underneath guy, but David Moore, he stretches the field, just like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. His average depth of target is 14.5 on the year. So just give the audience a little bit of your thoughts, of how you see Gordon fitting in and what that might do from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, before I do that, I do want to touch on, the volume point that you brought up for Russell Wilson. And I think one thing that differentiates 2019 from previous years for the Seahawks is their defense is much more vulnerable this year. So, it's not as often they're getting in game scripts where they can just run the ball. You look at, the past 5 or 6 games that they've played, their defense has allowed 34, 20, 30, 28, 29 points. And so, every week they're getting in these high scoring shootouts. So, the volume is better than it has been in the past. And so, Wilson's ceiling is obviously going to be higher with that volume. When we talk about what Josh Gordon's going to do to the offense, I think midseason receiver acquisitions typically are, a bit of a lottery ticket. You never really know what you're going to get. A lot of it depends on how quickly the receiver is able to pick up offenses. Josh Gordon, obviously, last year in New England was able to come in and, reliably see the field, make some plays for New England in what is, widely known as one of the more complex offenses for receivers. A lot of adjustments at the line of scrimmage, option routes, a quarterback who's not going to put up for mistakes from receivers, and Tom Brady. If you're not running the right routes and making the right adjustments, he's not even going to look your way. And oftentimes you want him to be on the field. So I think Gordon's shown that he can pick up an offense quickly, even a complex offense quickly. Some of it also depends on how willing the team is to install, a smaller package of plays for that receiver and sort of tailor certain looks to that receiver who came in the middle of the season. When Gordon's on the field, which at this point it's hard to say how much he's going to see the field, I think it won't necessarily eat into the production for Lockett or Metcalf. I think that it will grow the pie for the offense as a whole. I also don't expect Gordon to be, an exclusive player in terms of totally shutting out David Moore and Jerron Brown from seeing the field. He'll probably have a limited snap share. So I think the offense will get more potent. They may sub him in for DK Metcalf every once in a while, because those two players do have, somewhat overlapping skill sets. So I could see them envisioning somewhat of a split there. But I'd like to see those 3 guys on the same field, in which case I think the pie for the whole offense in those scenarios will get bigger, and he may take away some attention from Lockett in terms of defensive attention, or defensive attention from Metcalf. In New England, Josh Gordon was the guy seeing the number 1 corner week in, week out. And so if defenses treat him like they were in New England, and, Seattle has some scarier downfield threats than what New England had around Gordon, so it may not be the case. But if he's able to attract that type of attention, it's going to really open things up for Lockett and Metcalf.
So to me, I think we're on the same page here. What I feel like is this is a positive for Russell Wilson. It's a positive for, the Seahawks offense overall. If you're a Seahawks fan, this is great. If you're the Josh Gordon owner, though, from a fantasy perspective, and it's not like he was doing a ton, so far with the Patriots, I guess the positive here is he is matched up with a quarterback that can probably highlight his strengths, right? But I feel like the amount of time he's going to be on the field and the amount of times he's going to be running routes when Russell Wilson's dropping back to pass is going to probably be much lower than what he was accustomed to in New England, which from a fantasy perspective, I think it's going to make him a dicey proposition. I think he's going to have weeks where he's going to score his touchdown. He'll have his big play, and you'll probably feel fine about having him in your lineup. But I think he's going to be hard to trust Obviously this first week you're not going to jam him into your lineup. It's like you said, every team is a little bit different in how they handle these things. We'll have a better read after this week, but my gut is telling me that he's just not probably going to be a super valuable fantasy asset, unless you're in a super deep league. What are your thoughts?
If I had to put my money on the table right now, I would go with what you just described. It's hard to rely on him to come in so late in the season and be a primary option. So it's there's a very good chance that he is 3 or 4 receivers down the pecking order in terms of targets. Does have the capacity to make big plays, so there's always a chance that he'll have a big week. You look at Metcalf this season, and he's been somewhat boom or bust in terms of his production week to week, and a lot of that is the nature of the targets he's seeing down the field. One thing that I think is common is a comparison in people's minds between Metcalf and Gordon, because they're both really big receivers. They're both explosive receivers who run faster than you would think it's possible at that size. I think at this stage in his career, as I mentioned earlier, Metcalf is the more explosive player. He's faster. But Josh Gordon is really much more polished at running, the entire route tree. He's always had better feet and agility than what Metcalf has shown thus far in his career. And so, again, I do think there's a chance that he sees the field reliably in a complementary role to Lockett and Metcalf. And if he's able to pick up the offense, the talent, in my opinion, is still there. And I do think that at the high end of outcomes, he could be a reliable, wide receiver, low end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. But that is not what I would project, because I think that most likely there's going to be some kind of integration process, and it's going to be boom bust, where there are weeks where he'll score, single digits. And then there will be 1 week sprinkled in where he has a couple big catches and it's a big week. So, hard to count on a guy like that. So more exciting from an NFL perspective than a fantasy perspective, I'd say, in terms of from the Gordon perspective.
So Gordon's a guy, for me, if you can move him, you do it, right? If you're in a season-long type situation, if you're in a dynasty, if he flashes here, this could potentially mean a little bit more. But if you're in a season-long type format, if you can get something for him, his name still has value. You might still be able to get something for him. So let's talk a little bit now. We've got Darrell Bevell, who is the former coordinator in Seattle, and departed from there a couple of years ago, that's now in Detroit. And this is another offense, Jay, it's just what Matt Stafford's doing, is kind of what I think people have been waiting to see Matt Stafford do for years now. Early in Matt Stafford's career, he was seen, really as an elite fantasy, option at quarterback. And a lot of that was based on volume. And then, people kept buying into that, but he wasn't able to, produce those same type of results despite having a higher draft price. And now, we're to the point in his career where people have just pretty much had forgotten, about Matt Stafford. He wasn't being drafted at all in most formats. So Stafford's a guy that, because I wait on quarterbacks so long, Stafford's a guy that I own over half of my teams. He's a guy that I picked up very early in the season, just when I saw the offense really clicking, and I just looked at the style of the receivers that they had around him and the way that they were using him, and just felt that was a good fit with the way Stafford plays. But this is another guy that if you look at where he sits today, he's got 2,499 yards on the season. It's funny, he and Russell Wilson, from that perspective, almost identical. And listen to this, his yards per attempt, 8.59. Russell Wilson's at 8.55. 19 touchdown passes versus 22, for Russell Wilson. So Stafford, in his own right, Jay, he's producing, on a very high level. He does have, a 5,000 plus yard passing, year in his, career already. So he may not break his own personal record, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did, this year. He's a guy that just continues to put up, big results each week. And again, starting to talk about the guys that are around him. You talk about, Kenny Golladay. You talk about Marvin Jones. And we can come back to those guys in a minute, but they seem to be a great fit. And Darrell Bevell seems to be, really maximizing their talents and pairing that with what Stafford does really well. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing with Stafford, in this kind of rejuvenated, state of his career, and how he's helping fantasy teams, and do you see it continuing?
Yeah, well, Stafford is an interesting case study in terms of, nonlinear development. So the thing that's always been there with Stafford is really elite arm talent. He's great arm strength, always has had very good accuracy to all levels of the field, even the really deep areas of the field, 35 plus yards downfield. And when he came into the league, he was on the Lions. He had Calvin Johnson, who's, one of the best deep downfield receivers really of all time when you think about it. And so he was able to utilize his arm talent and an elite receiver to, put up great production. And he had some huge years there with Calvin Johnson. But in doing that, wasn't necessarily forced to learn the finer points of quarterback play, working through progressions, reading the defense, attacking vulnerabilities in the defense. So then once Calvin Johnson had his injuries, wasn't there any longer, he really struggled to be effective with the downfield passing game when he didn't have that elite talent to really open things up. And then Jim Bob Cooter came in and installed a short passing offense that really, most short passing offenses are really built around processing, finding the open man, attacking where the defense is weak. And so Stafford was then forced to develop in those areas because, the offense wasn't relying on his arm talent as much as his mental processing. He sort of reached a peak with that style of offense over the past couple of years. And interestingly, their receivers, Golladay and Jones, are both players who really specialize downfield, tracking the ball, adjusting to the ball, excellent hands, hand-eye coordination, can make catches under physical coverage, contested catches. And so it's funny because then they were sort of doing this square peg, round hole with the talent they had on hand, with Jim Bob Cooter calling the plays, quick passing game. And now this year with Bevel, they've opened it up a bit in terms of, intermediate deep passes down the field. And it's really a great scheme fit now with who Stafford is, having developed his processing, his mental abilities as a passer, and, with arm talent that's still there, has always been there. And then the accessory talent they have around them. And then another factor is, Kerryon Johnson obviously was injured, and then Trey Carson was injured coming, as he had been worked in as sort of a three-way, three-headed monster in the backfield. So they're very thin at running back, and a lot of the power run game stuff that they've tried to do this year hasn't worked, even when Kerryon Johnson was in the lineup. So they've really had to move away from that a bit because of injuries and ineffectiveness. And really, it's an offense now that runs through Stafford, higher volume passing attack than what people thought going into the year, as Bevel had talked about wanting to establish the run. Matt Patricia was saying the same things. So, these two quarterbacks really surprisingly, or, pass heavier than anticipated. And both of them are great talents who have offenses that are really, well designed to their strengths.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Stafford on the year, he's already got this season, he's already got 4 games, Jay, where he's thrown for over 350 yards. Listen to his average depth of target, in these games. This is for each game: 12.4, 10.6, 12.2, 13.3, 10.4, 9.1, 12.1, 11.7. So that's very similar to what Bevel did, with Russell Wilson, right? Back, with Seattle. It's really it's based on pushing the ball down the field. And like you said, Stafford's always had the arm talent. And it's just something where, like you said, it seems to really be clicking. I mean, so we talked a moment ago about Tyler Lockett and DK
and one thing on Stafford, Patrick Mahomes gets a lot of credit for the no-look passes. When you watch Stafford, I'm just saying this because it's so fun to see. He made a few no-look passes last week against the Raiders that were really just outstanding. And he'll make some tight window throws that are scratching your head as to how that ball made its way in there. So, he's one of the more fun quarterbacks to watch. So just wanted to point that out before we move on to the next topic.
No, that's good. No, that's good. I mean, and really, this stuff just all goes together anyway.
Yeah.
All I was going to touch on was, Marvin Jones. We talked about DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, a moment ago, from a standpoint of catch rate. Those guys are ranked second and fourth in the league. Marvin Jones is ranked seventh on passes over 20 yards. So he's got 14 targets, 7 receptions, 200 yards. He doesn't have any touchdowns. But if you go down to Kenny Golladay, listen to this, Jay, 23 targets over 20 yards. That is by far the most in the league. And he's got 3 touchdowns. He's got 300 yards on plays over 20 yards or more, and 3 touchdowns. So, yeah, it's a vertical passing game. Like you said, these seem to be 2 guys in different ways that specialize, going downfield. When I watch Marvin Jones, I see more of an acrobatic, he's 6'2", but, he almost plays with more finesse, right? And the way that he creates angles and separation. Kenny Golladay is almost like just brute strength. They both win in different ways, but they can be applied similarly, on the field, and the Lions are doing a great job of doing that. And then, you add in TJ Hawkinson and you add in Danny Amendola. And so those 2 guys being able to work the interior of the field, so basically this is an offense, that can create a mismatch in the passing game, pretty much anywhere on the field. TJ Hawkinson hasn't, done as much since his week 1 breakout, but, he's still a guy that poses a threat. He's had a couple of very close misses on touchdown passes down in the red zone and in the end zone. So those are guys that can really work, as well. The thing about Golladay, Jay, I mean, if you look at his opportunities, I mean, nobody in the league is getting the type of leverage opportunities that he is across the board. So if you look at end zone targets, he's third. He has 11 targets in the end zone this year. The top in the NFL is 13, second is 12th, and he's sitting at 11. And then if you look at air yards, Jay, he's got 1,080. That's second in the league. So, I mean, you're talking about the fantasy receiver that's got the second most air yards, and he's got the third most targets in the end zone. And we already talked about, his big plays and his touchdowns that he scored on over 20 yards or more. So Kenny Golladay is a guy that, I didn't draft enough of because I thought, I'm not real sure about, his full skill set. I saw him as being a guy that was, from an application perspective, is good at, 3 or 4 things, not like 6 things. And I was concerned about, how much the team was going to run versus pass. And like you said, this offense has evolved. But if you own Kenny Golladay, he's only at a 21% target share, which is right around where I projected him. I had him at 22%. But man, this efficiency and the rebound that we've seen from Stafford, is insane. What are your any other thoughts, on these receivers or any other components of the offense?
Yeah, definitely. I think that Marvin Jones has always, throughout his whole career, been a bit underrated, or not a bit, but pretty substantially underrated.
Well, our founder here, Matt, Waldman, is a huge Marvin Jones proponent. Always has.
Yeah, I can just see him grinning ear to ear as we talk about it. And I think because his frame, he's a slight of frame, but he sort of plays a little bit more like a bigger receiver. And he does have those finesse elements and really those acrobatic catches that you talk about. But also, his ability to fight through physical coverage and make plays down the field, I think is really underrated, probably because of what he looks like on the field, being a slight, skinny guy. There was a play last week where Stafford, targeted him down the left sideline. I actually posted this over on my Twitter account this morning. Deep shot, I think about 45 air yards down the field, left sideline, slightly behind Jones, who had created separation. So he has to come back, and it becomes a contested catch. Tracks the ball perfectly, gets the DB off him with his elbow, jumps leaning back and snags the ball with his hands, lands on his back with the defensive back on top of him, makes the catch. And really, Jones has been doing those types of things his whole career. Just the volume hasn't always been there. So I think that he is really an excellent receiver and one of the most underrated receivers in the NFL. And then Golladay, he's always been big, physical, aggressive, really good hands, really good ball tracking, some of the similar strengths that I just talked about with Marvin Jones. But, he's not necessarily explosive in his routes, his route running, his releases against press, his manipulation of leverage using his route stem was really subpar his rookie year last year. He's improved in those areas. He's still not elite, and that's why he doesn't necessarily create a ton of separation. But Stafford trusts him, and he's going to target him and trust that he'll create that micro separation using his physicality and his ball tracking and hand-eye coordination skills. So, both of those receivers are very good to excellent receivers in the NFL. And then Amendola is a very reliable slot option. TJ Hawkinson is developing. He can do some excellent things, running lateral breaking routes against tight ends, safeties. And they've provided enough threat under the field to where if teams are able to take away both of those excellent receivers they have out wide, they have third and fourth options that are effective enough to keep the ball moving.
Yeah, so I guess the real question for fantasy owners here, right? Do we see Stafford, continuing this? Do we see him landing in the top 5-6 quarterbacks? When it comes, time for fantasy playoffs, can people trust Stafford? Is he a guy to target in a trade, or if you already have him on your team, do you feel comfortable plugging him into your lineup, each week?
Yeah, I think that he's a guy that I'd be riding with at this point. Again, when you talk about game script, their defense hasn't been as effective as people necessarily thought it would be this year. So he's been in a lot of high-scoring games. I think that will continue. And, with an offense designed to his skill set and surrounding talent that matches what he does well, there's always a high ceiling there, just like what we talked about with Russell Wilson.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, like I said, I own him on a ton of my teams. So I'm excited, to have him because honestly, when I picked him up, I felt good about what they were doing, but I didn't honestly think that I was getting, a top 6, fantasy quarterback. I thought I had a top 12 guy, and so I've been thoroughly happy, with the results I've gotten. So
I think it really speaks to the value of the strategy that you always employ, as you mentioned earlier, in waiting to draft a quarterback. Every year, first of all, if you're in a standard 12-team league, single quarterback, there are more good quarterbacks than there are starting spots. So you can always get a guy in the last couple rounds. And then every year, 1 or 2 or 3 of those players has a better season than before because the talent has always been there. And it's really the surrounding factors that go into, a productive fantasy season. Stafford's always been a really good NFL quarterback. His fantasy production hasn't always been there because, differences in how good their defense is or the coaching approach or the surrounding talent. And so, it's just a great lesson in terms of taking in those, peripheral factors and trying to get a quarterback at the end of your draft rather than reaching for someone early.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of folks have caught on to that strategy, but still every year, you see folks that, want to take quarterbacks early. And it's not that you can never take a quarterback early, but I think, yeah, it's a great job by you just to it's a great reminder, because a guy like Stafford, literally, I mean, that's one of the best examples because just for the most part, probably wasn't drafted. And most of the folks that are listening, as far as Kenny Golladay goes, honestly, he's the number 10 wide receiver in PPR formats, right now. And honestly, Jay, there's more meat left on the bone. I mean, a guy that's getting that many air yards, that's getting that many targets in the end zone, it's kind of strange to say because I thought Kenny Golladay this season, I would have felt good with him as my wide receiver 2, but right now he's already sitting in the top 12. And honestly, he could easily be 6th or 5th just based on the opportunities that he's getting. And they're consistently continuing to give him those type of opportunities. So Kenny Golladay, honestly, it sounds kind of weird, but he's really a buy low right now. Yeah, he's acting as a wide receiver 1, and you're going to have to pay a decent price. But I think there's actually more that you could get from him because of, the way that they're utilizing him. And I would expect him to continue on as a wide receiver 1, for the rest of the season. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Just a
Okay.
great
Well,
scheme
cool.
fit. Stafford trusts him. The volume's there. The depth of targets are there. Sometimes a bit, hit or miss you see in Tampa Bay with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Again, two excellent receivers who are in an offense that really fits their talents well. Week to week, you aren't necessarily sure he's going to get the lion's share. Good pun based on the team we're talking about. But completely accidental. The lion's share of the production. But, more weeks than not, Golladay is going to give you a week that you're happy about.
Yeah, and just from a standpoint of over the course of the season, his target shares have been 20%, 33%, 25%, 26%, 28%. He's had one game that hurt him. He had a 4%er in week 7 when it went 29% to Marvin Jones and 22% to Danny Amendola. But then he bounced back with a 25% in week 8. And then he had his second lowest of the season last week in week 9, which was 17%, but he still had 2 targets in the end zone. And he's getting the most targets of the team, by far. Hawkins, he's got 41% of those on the season. Marvin Jones has 22% of those with 6. He had 4, obviously, in week 7 when he had that huge fantasy week. And then you have TJ Hawkinson, who's got 5 targets in the end zone on the season. So he's third on the team. So, yeah, I think those guys are all solid options. I like Marvin Jones, as well. I don't like him quite as much as Golladay. I've got him more in the wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2 range. He seems to be the guy that takes on a little bit more fluctuation, week to week. But, he's a lot closer to, Kenny Golladay than a lot of folks may, realize. And then Danny Amendola, he's a tougher guy to use. You've really got to, it's more of an anticipation thing, with him, because you need one of the weeks where he's going to be running a route on 80, 75% of the dropbacks, which is really based more on matchup. Because they just deploy their guys differently based on, who their opponent is, and which, makes sense. This is Matt Patricia. He comes from the Bill Belichick tree. So Danny Amendola is basically, he's their Julian Edelman that, comes off the field, doesn't get to play Z, but he's the guy that they like in the slot.
Yeah, and I think that, in speaking to that variability, when you have 2 really good receivers, I think that a lot of it comes down to the defensive approach. If teams are going to treat Golladay like a true number 1, sticking their number 1 corner or even having extra safety help over the top, Marvin Jones is good enough to then capitalize, which is why you see that 4% target week, and Marvin Jones getting 29%. So Stafford's not going to necessarily force it to Golladay like Michael Thomas. Regardless of the coverage Michael Thomas is facing, he's going to get his targets in New Orleans. Studying the defensive trends, man versus zone. Does his team have a number 1 corner that's really shadowing one guy or the other? Or are they someone that tends to double team the number 1? That can give you a little bit of window of insight into what to expect week to week. You mentioned again how that applies to Amendola as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What was interesting is when they played the Packers, Jair Alexander shadowed Marvin Jones, not Kenny Golladay.
Often, and this is something I've noticed actually over the last couple of years, often Marvin Jones does draw the team's number 1 corner. And I think that often NFL teams will devote their better corner to the receiver that they think is better at separating. So even though Golladay is thought of, he leads the team in targets, and he's thought of as the Lions' number 1 receiver, especially when you're talking about in a fantasy sense, Marvin Jones is a little bit better of a separator, runs a lot of downfield routes that are potentially more dangerous to a defense. And often NFL teams will really just devote extra attention to those types of guys rather than, the big guy who's a little less explosive but can make contested catches.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's switch gears now and let's talk about an offense. And this is not a terrible offense by any means, but it's just it's a passing offense that's, to me, is underperforming a little bit, Jay. And it may not be for you, but coming into this season, my expectations, for Carson Wentz were higher, I think, than what yours and Matt's were. But Wentz he's not doing terrible. He's still, in the top 12 quarterbacks as far as fantasy goes. But I'm just, we're not seeing, those big weeks. We're not seeing, those consistent, 300-yard, 2-3 touchdown, type weeks. That's just not, what we're getting, from Wentz, at this point. If you look at what he's done on the season, he's sitting at the 11th ranked quarterback. He's got 2,060 yards. He's got 15 touchdown passes. He's got 4 interceptions. So, I mean, those things all sound good. But whenever you start to break it down by week, you just heard what we did with Stafford and all of those huge games. So Wentz got off to a great start in week 1. He had 313 yards. He threw for 3 touchdowns. But since then, 231 yards and 1 touchdown. Then 259 and 2, not too bad. 160, and he paid off with 3 touchdowns. But then 189 and 1 touchdown, 306 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's pretty good. But then 191 and 1, 172 and 1, and then 239 yards and 1 touchdown. And, that week 1 effort was with Deshaun Jackson on the field, which obviously, he has not had again, since then. And now Deshaun has been shut down. So it's a team that doesn't really have, a true deep threat. It doesn't have that vertical element. And I think that's part of, what is hurting, Wentz and the team. When I look across, the field and I see a guy like Alshon Jeffrey and I see a guy like Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, they're all very good players. But none of them really, I think, scare opposing defenses as far as being able to really, make them pay, with a huge play. It's got to be much more of a methodical possession type offense to move the ball, down the field in that fashion. And so when you look at Wentz right now, he's not quite paying off on, the draft capital that most people, were spending on him. If you look at, his deep passing, that's an area where, he hasn't. And again, I think some of this goes back to what I was just talking about with the fit, with the players that he has, around him. But if you look at what he's done from a deep passing perspective, he's not anywhere close to a lot of the guys to the 2 guys that we just talked about before. His right now, he's sitting at 11th in the league. He's got 39 attempts, but he's only got 437 yards off of that, versus if you look at a guy like Russell Wilson, 824 yards coming off of the deep passing, right? And Russell Wilson's got 7 touchdowns in that area, where Wentz has only got 4, and Wentz also has 3 picks. So that's something, that's been, a bit of an issue. And that's something that Matt really talks about with Wentz, is that he's not really a great deep ball thrower.
Can I add something?
Yeah. Jump in.
Yeah. So just want to jump in here and point out the difference between a pinpoint passer and a general area passer downfield. In Russell Wilson's case, and that's something, Matt talks about all the time, pinpoint versus general area accuracy. Russell Wilson is as pinpoint a downfield thrower as it gets in the NFL. And when you have passers like that can really put it where it needs to be, right in the hands, over the shoulder, in the breadbasket, it's less dependent on the receiver's skill. The success of the play is less dependent on the receiver's skill. It helps to have those guys like Lockett and Metcalf that can track the ball well and make the tough catches downfield. But Wilson will still be productive even without guys who really specialize in that area, because his passes are so accurate. Wentz is a general area accuracy guy. He can throw it deep. The ball will get in a general vicinity of where the receiver is. So for passers like that, the effectiveness of their downfield throwing really depends on the quality of the receiver. So you saw when Deshaun Jackson was out there week 1, Wentz was able to hit him a couple times with some nice deep passes. Jackson could adjust to the ball, manipulate his path so he's catching it on the run with separation. When you don't have a guy like that, now these general area throws go to receivers who aren't good at tracking or adjusting to the ball or manipulating the defensive back to create that last-minute separation, and the plays just don't work. You have the internet memes where Nelson Aguilar is running downfield, a pass is a couple yards inside, and he just sort of, limply jogs through the throw rather than trying to adjust and catch it. And that's who Aguilar has been. He's never been excellent at tracking downfield passes. He's more of an underneath type of player, slot type of player. And so Wentz doesn't have a receiver that can capitalize on those general area throws down the field. And so it's led to, really difficult time downfield, and the receivers get a lot of blame for that. But Wentz's tendency to be a general area thrower down the field, also is part of the problem.
So where you have, Russell Wilson, almost being a perfect match, and he can actually overcome some of those things, for his receivers. With Wentz, it's if you don't have a receiver that can do those things, and then you pair it, with a guy like him that just has the general accuracy, then that's creating issues, is what I think I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely sort of it in a nutshell. And just, also just highlighting the difference between pinpoint accuracy and general accuracy and where it makes a difference, because that is something that Matt talks about, and it's such a great point when evaluating passers, because those pinpoint accurate passers are guys who will have success regardless of the context, whereas the general accuracy guys, it's going to be more hit or miss game to game, year to year, because a lot of it depends on the surrounding factors that are there.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about these pass catchers. If you drafted Zach Ertz, you probably drafted him as a top 3 tight end, off of the board. Maybe you took Kittle ahead of him, but it was pretty normal to see Kelsey go, then Ertz go, and then Kittle go. And this last weekend, Ertz, kind of rebounded. He got 28% of the targets. But before that, in the previous several weeks, it just wasn't happening, for Zach Ertz. 21% of the targets, 20% of the targets, 19% of the targets, 17% of the targets. And while those are all, those are nice, Jay, whenever you take a guy like Zach Ertz, you're counting on, 25%, targets pretty much every week. But Dallas Goedert has really become a thing. So here are his targets, 20%, 15, 17, and then 10 over the last 4 weeks. And his routes per dropback are increasing. His snaps are increasing. So this is an offense that really has moved to more, of a 12 personnel look. And it seems to also be impacting Zach Ertz, because now, you've got the targets being split between the two guys working in a similar area. If you look at their average depth of target, they're not real far apart either. Ertz is at a 9.4. Goddard's slightly shallow, which I would almost expect the opposite. His is slightly shallower at a 6.6. So did you notice anything with these, two tight ends, or even just, the personnel in general and the way that they're being used, and any thoughts from a fantasy perspective going forward?
Yeah, I mean, when I watch this offense, I think that a lot of it comes down to not having great personnel to fit what they're trying to do, and then also to fit with Carson Wentz's strengths as a passer. Ertz is really a timing and rhythm player. He runs those short intermediate routes, creates separation, and sort of has a window where he's ready for a pass. And if you miss that window, the window's going to close, because he's not going to then explode and create separation for 5, 6, 7 steps as he's developing his route. When I've watched Wentz this year, he's really not getting rid of the ball at the top of his drop. He'll take his drop, he'll pat the ball a few times. The windows are open, then they close. It's a great play, 3rd and 3 this week, 3rd and goal at the 3-yard line. They run a little double slant with Goddard and Ertz, and Ertz is, the second player coming in behind Goddard. And there's a window there right at the top of Wentz's drop where he should just get rid of the ball to Ertz. There's a safety closing, windows close very quickly in the red zone, just because everything's more compressed. But there's a window there, should have been a 3-yard touchdown. Wentz hesitates, misses the window, then goes to his 3rd, 4th option before he's sacked. And so I think a lot of the struggle has been that Ertz isn't getting the ball in those windows where it's open. And, it's just out of sync with Wentz, with the receivers. I think Deshaun Jackson was a huge part of their offense going into the season. When you look at week 1, the type of routes he was running, the volume of targets he was receiving, there was a significant portion of this offense that was really designed around having a guy like that, and they just don't have that now. And I think a lot of it is downstream effects from missing that type of guy. And then also, Wentz not really progressing as a timing, rhythm, anticipation thrower.
So do you see, Wentz as being, a buy low type candidate? I mean, is this something that, you see correcting itself, or is this a bigger issue And this probably just is what it is, for the season. And you're better off with a guy like a Matt Stafford or a Russell Wilson.
Well, when I'm talking about, I mean, for the rest of the season, and also, when you're talking about dynasty, I'm a guy who leans toward the talent. And I think, a lot of people want to make Wentz an elite quarterback, but I don't think he's in the same category of talent as a player, both in terms of arm talent and then also, the cognitive side of quarterbacking, processing, anticipating, making tight window throws on time. He's a tier or two below both of those guys in that category. And so for me, long term, I'm rolling with the guy who is the better talent. Wentz has benefited from really an elite offensive line and, a pretty good stable of surrounding talent that hasn't been able to quite produce quite as well this year. And I think my personal opinion is that he is a bit overrated in terms of, questions about whether he is elite or not. I don't think that he's particularly close to being an elite NFL quarterback for various reasons that I pointed out: the general accuracy issues, the processing, making throws on time to the intermediate areas of the field. I think in the NFL, if a quarterback can't, go back, read 1, 2, 3 receivers and make a 15-yard throw, between a tight window with anticipation consistently, that eventually those quarterbacks run into struggles because those are really the most difficult routes to take away from a defensive perspective. And so you see the guys who have long-term success, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, and they're really able to do that consistently and reproducibly throughout their whole career. So I think Wentz has to grow as a quarterback. I haven't seen it yet. For the rest of this season, especially when you factor in the surrounding personnel and how it hasn't been a great fit in Philadelphia, I'm definitely rolling with Stafford and especially Wilson over him, rest of the season.
Yeah, what's interesting, with this offense, Jay, is it's typically been one of the more pass-heavy offenses in the league, but it's something where they've really been running the ball more. So we talked about Seattle earlier being at a 58% of their plays were actually pass plays or where they drop back to pass. So that's not attempts, but truly dropping back to pass. They could end up getting sacked. They could end up, scrambling. But if you look at Philly, is at the same number, 58%. And this is normally a team that would be, up around a 65% mark. So Philly almost seems to have adjusted as well. And I would feel bad if we didn't at least go ahead and hit on one more topic while we're on Philly. I know we were mostly talking about quarterbacks and passing game and the passing games, but I know that, we're a podcast that's been kind of rough on Miles Sanders. And I saw you put some new video out on Sanders, and you had some positive things to say about him and some things that he's doing on the field. So, do you want to highlight some of those things?
Yeah, well, I think Doug Peterson has shown to be a smart coach, and he's a guy who uses his players to their strengths. Some coaches, if a player struggles, they'll put him in the doghouse. They won't see the field. Sanders lost his opportunity as, the every down between the tackles back. Obviously, over the past several weeks, Jordan Howard has led the backfield in carries by a wide margin. And they've really established a pretty consistent running game. They have a great blocking offensive line in terms of the run game. And Jordan Howard is just such a solid, reliable runner who really, processes well between the tackles, picks up an extra 1, 2, 3 yards as he's going down through contact. And so it's really been a nice, consistent fit there. And he may not offer the explosive upside that they liked with Sanders, but that consistency, and we talked about this with Sanders going in, that consistency is really important to keeping that offense on schedule and productive and having those consistent drives that get you in scoring position. Now, that doesn't mean Sanders is completely useless as a player. He is explosive. He's very fast. He has good balance, good agility. And so Peterson has schemed him into space. They've used him a lot as a receiver. They've gotten him looks in the running game where, it's more gap style runs. Okay, you run through this gap. The play's either going to be there or it's not. If they get a lane, he has that explosiveness to take it for a big one. And really, one thing that's promising for me in terms of his development, and this is the video I posted this morning, is that in the open field, he sort of slowed down a little bit, and that's an important process for NFL players coming in from college, where the tendency is to want to speed everything up. And so it's a play where he catches the ball on a screen. Instead of just getting out ahead and getting tackled by the first guy, he slows down, perfect timing with his linemen who are releasing to block downfield on the screen. Really manipulates the leverage of the defender as he's coming up into the right tackle and runs that defender into the block and, picks up an extra 10, 15 yards by manipulating the leverage in that manner. And that was really, really great stuff by Sanders and really promising for his development as a runner, not only in the open field, but also potentially between the tackles, because understanding that leverage is really a key component to being able to understand where to go between the tackles. It's just everything inside happens faster and there's a little less time to read it. So a very, very promising play for Sanders.
Yeah, so I had to make sure we brought that up.
Yeah.
Because I've actually had comments on Twitter that we're the Sanders haters. So
yeah, I posted that video and someone's like, "Oh wow, a positive post on Miles Sanders. It's a good Friday."
It is definitely a good Friday. Well, I think that's going to do it for us, Jay. Is there anything else that you wanted to hit on, before we hop off?
No, I think I'm good. Excited to see how the rest of the season is playing out. Had a lot of fun talking to you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And if you guys aren't following Jay, you need to be following him on Twitter. It's at JMoyerFB. You can follow me at Dwain McFarland. That's DWAIN. Of course, we both do other work for the RSP. So you guys make sure that you're following at Matt Waldman. And checking out all of his great work and Jay's work there. Jay's been doing some great breakdowns on running backs, each week that I like to read. So some really great stuff there that's going to help get you smarter. But until we see you next time, you guys, good luck unless you're playing one of us. See ya.